In the final months as the Great War destroyed Europe, a scary rumor began to spread in the British trenches. Some soldiers said that the German Empire was building a machine unlike anything ever seen before. An armored giant so huge that even the veteran British Mark tanks, symbols of Allied industrial power, seemed small compared to it. That whisper, repeated among the men who kept watch from the smoke-covered walls, became a silent shadow capable of freezing them with fear. The confidence of even the most experienced soldier was weakened. While the British used their Mark I's and then their Mark IV's, perfecting a revolutionary idea that was changing land warfare, the German High Command watched with a mixture of amazement and worry. What at first seemed like a British luxury, a slow and noisy land ship, was becoming a real strategic threat. The difference was clear. Where the United Kingdom was already mass-producing tanks, Germany was only just beginning. The debate centered on whether to enter the technology race that promised to change the balance of the conflict forever. Pressure grew, and intelligence reports confirmed that British Mark tanks were breaking through barbed wire, defeating machine gun positions, and creating openings where traditional infantry faced only death and stalemate. Clearly, Germany could not afford to fall behind. This created the urgent need to design its own armored vehicle, and so the unspecified vehicle was born. This project would create the first German tank in history, the A7V Sturmpanzerwagen. The job was given to Joseph Vollmer, one of the most brilliant minds in German automotive design. Vollmer received a goal as ambitious as it was contradictory: to build a steel monster capable of measuring over 10 meters in length, crossing deep trenches, moving at a reasonable speed despite its enormous weight, and mounting a combination of a front cannon and multiple machine guns capable of overwhelming any defensive position. All of this had to be done with limited resources, in the middle of war, and with an industry under extreme pressure. The first drawings shaped a vehicle that looked nothing like the British Mark tanks. While those were long, narrow, and designed to slide across deep trenches, the future A7V looked like an armored block mounted on tracks with an almost scary appearance. Its front armor reached 30 millimeters, enough to stop rifle rounds and machine gun fire. The engine, or rather the two Daimler engines located in the center of the vehicle, promised to move the giant, but at the cost of turning the interior into a metal oven. At the end of 1917, the prototype left the Berlin factories. Its presence was so huge that the officers who attended the demonstration were amazed. Beneath that enormous structure lay a firepower that combined a 57-millimeter cannon, ironically captured from the British in Belgium, and 6 MG-08 machine guns that required 2 crew members each. Inside, up to 18 men shared such a tight space that every movement had to be calculated to avoid getting in the way of the others. But what most impressed observers was the feeling of being in the presence of a machine that not only aimed to match British tanks, but to beat them through sheer force. Germany had just entered mechanized warfare, and although it was late to the game, it was determined to do so with a vehicle whose presence on the battlefield would be impossible to ignore. In the next part, we'll see how these steel giants went from training to their first real operations, facing unforgiving terrain and mechanical problems that would test the patience and courage of each crew member. The training process for driving an A7V quickly showed a reality that no technical manual could clearly explain. That monster needed a crew that not only mastered its job, but also accepted living with extreme heat, deafening noise, and a space so tight that any mistake could block the movement of the entire team. The 18 men inside the armored vehicle worked almost shoulder to shoulder, surrounded by ammunition boxes, fuel lines, tools, and mechanisms that shook constantly. Breathing became difficult when the engines began to overheat, and it was common for the visibility to be reduced by the mixture of dust and metallic fumes. One of the first challenges came from the driver's position. From there, he could barely see what was in front of him, as the slits in the bodywork only allowed a narrow and broken view. To move forward without risking an immediate accident, he depended on the signals given to him by other crew members through side openings. However, when the engines roared and the machine guns began firing, communication became an act of faith. Shouts, banging on the helmet, and improvised signals were the only tools available to coordinate a machine weighing over 30 tons. The A7V's performance on the terrain also quickly showed its limitations. The deep holes created by weeks of relentless artillery fire were death traps for a vehicle of such height. A miscalculated turn or an overly steep incline could destabilize the structure. There were times when the A7V, tilting sharply over an invisible crater, threatened to tip over, leaving the entire crew holding their breath as the giant swayed dangerously. If it managed to right itself, it only served as a harsh reminder of the unforgiving nature of modern warfare.
Despite these challenges, the A7V's firepower commanded respect, even from the most doubtful. Its 57mm gun had a remarkable ability to break through improvised fortifications, machine gun nests, or enemy barricades. Surrounding it, the 6 MG-08s formed a ring of fire capable of saturating any exposed position. In theory, the armored vehicle could become a mobile fortress, and during practice exercises, several officers observed how its presence immediately changed the way the infantry advanced. The soldiers instinctively took shelter behind its massive steel, taking advantage of every movement of the tank to advance a few more meters without exposing themselves to enemy rifle fire. However, what particularly impressed the technicians was the machine's range. With 500 liters of fuel distributed across several tanks, the A7V could travel considerable distances on roads without needing to stop. But when it left the relatively stable roads and ventured into the war-torn countryside, its speed dropped drastically. Even so, that range was a significant advance by the standards of the time and demonstrated that the tank could reach positions where a simple transport vehicle would be rendered useless. Maintenance, on the other hand, quickly became an obsession for the engineers. The suspension, made up of 24 independent wheels, required constant inspections. Any excessive vibration, any unexpected impact could bend the most fragile components. Often, after just one day of maneuvers, it was necessary to take apart entire sections to prevent failures that could leave the armored vehicle stuck in the middle of an open field. The A7V did not forgive a lack of attention, and each deployed unit required an almost artisanal level of dedication from its mechanics. As the days went by, the crew teams also began to master the ritual of combat, ordering the machine gun fire, adjusting the barrel under bad conditions, compensating for the vibration that ran through the entire interior, coordinating movements so that no one hindered another, and above all, keeping their cool in a space where the noise could reach unbearable levels. The commander positioned by the periscope was the only one who could get a relatively clear picture of the external situation, which forced him to issue precise and almost instant orders. But the atmosphere changed when the soldiers had the opportunity to compare their own armored vehicle with the British Mark tanks captured at the front. They discovered, with some surprise, that the Mark tanks, despite their crude appearance and less refined technology, offered a stability that the A7V did not always guarantee. German soldiers appreciated the solid simplicity of the enemy armored vehicles, and this contrast sparked an internal debate that nevertheless could not change reality. Germany had already started on its own path and now had to take the A7V to the real battlefield. In the next part, we will see how the A7V was first used in genuine operations, discovering invisible enemies, unexpected forces, and a war that would give no mercy to any machine, however imposing. The moment of testing whether the A7V could survive actual combat came in early 1918. Units equipped with the new tanks were sent to sectors where High Command hoped to break through reinforced British positions after months of siege. Despite their doubts, the crews were convinced the machine would command respect as soon as it emerged from the fog and the roar of artillery. However, modern warfare would soon show that an impressive design did not guarantee survival. Reliability was not guaranteed.
In the offensive launched near the Saint-Quentin Canal, several A7V armored vehicles were ordered to advance in support of the infantry. They had barely covered a few hundred meters when the first cracks began to appear in that hope. One of the vehicles saw its right engine begin to overheat for no apparent reason. Another became stuck because one of its tracks stopped responding. A third began to produce abnormal vibrations that made the crew fear that the axle could break. Before even spotting the enemy, 3 vehicles were knocked out of action not by British fire, but by the natural fragility of their mechanical components. The A7Vs that did manage to reach the front line encountered a scene where British artillery didn't hesitate to concentrate fire on any structure that stuck up from the ground. Explosions erupted around the armored vehicles, raising dense columns of earth that pounded the steel with a force that shook the entire interior. For the 18 men trapped inside that metal box, each impact sounded as if the whole hull were about to shatter. Some crew members later confessed that they had never experienced such a deep noise, one that seemed to start in the floor and climb the walls until it echoed deep within their bones. Despite this chaos, the effect of the A7V's arrival was immediate. The British machine gun nests, which until that moment had stopped any German advance, began to retreat under the pressure of the front gun and the synchronized bursts of the MG-08s. The German infantry seized the opportunity, launching themselves behind the armored vehicle and advancing under cover while the tank absorbed most of the enemy fire. It was the first time many soldiers had seen a machine clear a path in places where previously only certain death had existed.
One of the vehicles, however, had an experience that remained recorded in official reports. While advancing over terrain full of craters and uneven ground, it partially fell into a hidden depression beneath a layer of wet mud. The weight of the armored vehicle caused a dangerous tilt to the left, and for what seemed like an eternity, the A7V swayed as if it were about to tip over. The crew, frozen in their seats, felt the machine slowly rock until it finally righted itself. That lucky maneuver not only saved the vehicle, but also made it clear that a miscalculation could render the giant completely useless. In terms of firepower, the A7V proved remarkably effective. The gunners, already familiar with the machine gun's internal movement, fired their machine guns through the reinforced openings, raising clouds of dust and shrapnel that forced the British defenders to seek immediate cover. The 57mm gun eliminated several positions that were slowing the German advance, and some officers described with amazement how small improvised fortifications were reduced almost instantly by the direct impact of shells. But it wasn't all strength and firepower. The battle also revealed worrying weaknesses. The suspension, so innovative in theory, suffered greatly, crossing terrain destroyed by weeks of attacks. Repeated vibrations loosened bolts, bent parts, and threatened the structure's stability. In some cases, the mechanics had to make repairs that required leaving the armored vehicle in the middle of a danger zone to adjust essential components before the machine lost mobility. It was clear that although the A7V had an impressive structure, its level of mechanical resistance was far from ideal for prolonged combat use. The operations at Saint-Quentin were not enough to decide the fate of these armored vehicles, but they did make it clear that Germany had entered a new form of warfare in which brute force did not guarantee survival. After this initial deployment, an event lay ahead that would forever mark military history: the first direct encounter between tanks. 3 A7Vs would face 3 British Marks in a clash that would start a completely different era in the art of war. In the next part, we will relive this unprecedented duel, a moment in which, for the first time in history, 2 mechanized weapons would face each other under enemy fire. The spring of 1918 brought with it one of the most unique and decisive episodes in military history, the first direct confrontation between tanks. Until then, armored vehicles had been used primarily to break out of fixed positions, but never before had 2 armored vehicles exchanged fire head-on. This would change near the town of Villers-Bretonneux, where 3 German A7Vs met 3 British Marks in a duel that would be forever etched in history. The 3 A7Vs were advancing in open formation, leaving enough space between them to avoid becoming easy targets for enemy artillery. The terrain was covered in a veil of fog that mixed with the smoke from the bombings, creating an atmosphere where visibility depended solely on the glimmers and shadows that emerged between the craters. Inside the armored vehicles,
The engines roared as if each vibration were a reminder that they were pushing technology beyond its limits. Suddenly, the commander of the first A7V spotted unmistakable shapes. The rectangular, elongated outlines of the British marks appeared through the mist. Two of them were female versions equipped only with machine guns, while the third was a male armed with two 6-pounder cannons. The clash was inevitable, and for the first time in history, steel was going to meet steel head-on. The British were the first to fire. The bursts from their machine guns hit against the A7V's armor but did not penetrate. To the German crew, these impacts sounded like hammers on a bell, but posed no immediate danger. The German commander then ordered the 57mm gun to be aimed at the mark. The explosion shook the entire interior and the shell was fired, striking the front of the British tank. However, the mark's thick armor absorbed the blow. Meanwhile, the two female marks, aware of being unable to engage the German gun, attempted to flank the German formation. Their machine guns fired relentlessly, more as a form of psychological pressure than a real threat. But the German MG-08s responded with such a density of fire that they forced the British to seek better cover. Then the male mark entered the scene, the only one capable of challenging the A7V. After adjusting its position, it fired a shell that struck the A7V's flank head-on. The impact shook the entire vehicle, generating a shockwave that rippled through the hull. The crew tried to compensate for the vibration, while the commander analyzed the path of the shot. Just seconds later, a second impact occurred, this time closer to the lower part of the armored vehicle. Internal alarms began to sound, indicating that some structure was being weakened. The third shell was decisive. The A7V, subjected to the weight of the impact in the uneven terrain, lost its balance and began to slide toward a deep crater. Its enormous mass tilted dangerously, and before the crew could react, the vehicle fell sideways into the hole, becoming stuck. The men, violently shaken, abandoned the vehicle as best they could as the machine filled with smoke.
The two remaining A7Vs understood the seriousness of the situation. The male mark had proven to be a real threat, and if they insisted on advancing along the same flank, they could fall one after another. Even so, they did not retreat without a fight. They adjusted their artillery and fired several times at the British. The impacts hit the side plates of the mark, which withstood the attack with difficulty. However, the elevated position from which the British were fighting gave them a crucial advantage. Every time the A7Vs tried to speed up to improve their firing angle, their limited visibility prevented the maneuver. The British crews, for their part, acted with the calmness that came from the experience gained since the first offensives on the Somme. They knew how to manage the recoil of their weapons and use the terrain to their advantage. A particularly intense exchange of fire resulted in one of the A7V tanks suffering damage to its running gear, forcing it to reduce its speed. The third German tank, realizing that the situation was becoming impossible, began a tactical withdrawal. In the end, the British maintained control of the terrain, but were surprised by the German resistance. Allied reports described the A7V as a formidable enemy, more accurate and stable in its firing than expected. The clash had no clear winner, but it produced an obvious conclusion. Mechanized warfare had definitely been born. The next part will tell the final fate of the A7V, its withdrawal from combat, and how a single unit survived to become the last testament to this first generation of armored monsters. After the duel at Villers-Bretonneux, the A7V had shown that Germany could compete on the mechanical front, but it had also become clear that German industry was far from being able to produce these giants in the necessary quantity. While the British and French manufactured thousands of units, the Germans were only able to complete 20. Such a limited number made each tank an extremely valuable resource, but also a luxury that could not be replaced in the event of loss. Even so, the A7Vs continued to see action during the offensives of 1918. In several operations, they were used as the spearhead, designed to break through fortified lines, relying on its front armor to hold long enough to allow infantry to advance. Although the tank had well-known problems off firm ground, its firepower and road speed remained an advantage over its slower, more difficult-to-maneuver British counterparts. But warfare had changed. Counter-battery artillery, improvised anti-tank guns, and landmines were now common and multiplying on all fronts. The A7Vs, with their high center of gravity and limited mobility, soon became prime targets. In several battles, the mere unevenness of poorly calculated terrain caused the vehicle to tilt dangerously, forcing its crew to constantly correct its path. The driver, who could barely see through a narrow slit, depended on the commander's shouted orders to avoid falling into a crater or getting stuck in mud. One of the most tense episodes occurred during the German counterattacks in the summer of 1918. An A7V tank was advancing with infantry support when a heavy shell exploded just meters from the vehicle. The impact kicked up a cloud of dust that hit the hull, completely blinding the machine gunners. For several seconds, the interior was filled with a chaotic mix of smoke, dust, and screams as the commander tried to regain control. When they finally managed to resume the advance, the tank found itself facing a trench wider than expected. The driver accelerated, hoping to get through it, but the tracks became suspended in mid-air, and the A7V tilted forward, trapped with no way to reverse. The crew had to evacuate under enemy fire as the British closed in to try to capture it. Other A7Vs met similar fates. Some were made unusable by mechanical failures, others were abandoned because the engine overheated or because the tracks were damaged on unstable terrain. In one extreme case, a tank was completely surrounded by enemy troops who, seeing that the Germans could not move it, demanded its surrender. The crew destroyed the internal equipment and escaped during the night, leaving the machine half buried in rubble. With the Allied advance speeding up in the final months of the war, the A7Vs began to be gradually pulled back from the front. In October and November, when the German forces could no longer maintain a solid defense, many armored vehicles were destroyed by their own crews to avoid capture. But one of them met an unexpected fate. Tank number 506, known as Mephisto, had been trapped in a crater weeks earlier, abandoned in no man's land. After several failed recovery attempts by both sides, it was finally the Australians who, in a careful and risky operation, managed to drag it under occasional fire back to their lines. For them, more than a trophy, Mephisto was a symbol, solid proof that this gigantic machine had been real, not just a trench legend. After the armistice, Mephisto was carefully transported to Australia, where it became the only original A7V unit to survive the war. Over time, its figure gained an almost mythical aura. Entire generations of visitors looked at it as if it were a sleeping monster, a relic of an era in which technology was still searching for its identity amidst the chaos. As the decades passed, the A7V transformed into a historical curiosity, a reminder of the early days of mechanized warfare. Other countries built replicas for museums and exhibitions, trying to capture the essence of that gigantic vehicle, which, despite all its limitations, marked a turning point on the battlefield. It was the beginning of an era where supremacy would no longer be decided by the ranks of infantry, but by the steel machines that rolled on tracks. And so ended the short but intense life of the first German tank, an imperfect giant, powerful, feared, limited by its small production numbers, but unforgettable. A steel monster that paved the way for a new era of armored warfare just before vanishing into the smoke and ruins of a world that would never be the same again.